Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this podcast, Tim and I, PRI's Director of Communications, and I had a conversation with Terry Anderson, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Terry was also a fellow at PRI in the early 1990s when he published his groundbreaking book, Free Market Environmentalism. Terry's current project is to study and raise awareness of the U.S.'s Native American community. The history, culture, and economic life of Native Americans have been romanticized by Hollywood films and popular myths. Terry breaks down those myths and discusses policy reforms that would reduce poverty and improve the quality of life for Native Americans. Tim and I both found this interview very interesting. We think you will too. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Next Round with PRI, Terry. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. Kind of a cold, blustery day here in Montana.
Well, this year PRI is celebrating its 40th anniversary. And back in the early days of PRI, you were actually a fellow. And you put PRI on the map by publishing your book, Free Market Environmentalism, in 1991, which in those days was pretty groundbreaking stuff. And in fact, if you go to our website, you'll see that we still mark the publishing of your book as one of PRI's milestones. So describe what PRI was like in those days and how the book was made such a big impact at the time.
Well, I'm just delighted to have been in on the ground floor and still connected and looking forward to helping celebrate the 40th anniversary next month. The initial days were focused on trying to find scholars writing on topics that had an unusual twist to them if you took a more conservative, market-oriented approach. And for me, given that my field is environmental policy, free market environmentalism was the perfect niche for that. Don Leal and I co-authored that book and, as you said, published in 1991. And I remember so vividly a review came out shortly after the book in a law journal, as I recall, and the reviewer said, free market environmentalism is an oxymoron, and the authors are the moron part. I think that kind of captures the extent to which it was not exactly something that everybody wrapped their arms around and sang Kumbaya. We've published 2 editions since. In many ways, I still love the first edition the most. But what changed was we moved from just kind of theory of how it might work to practice. We, over time, found more and more examples, and that meant more and more people were embracing the ideas. And I think PRI deserves all the credit for making this happen. Chip Mellor encouraged us to write the book. They published and got the contents out. It was reviewed in The Economist magazine. So we got lots of attention, and I'm pleased to say thanks to the work of PRI, and hopefully that book, we have changed the way people think about environmental policy.
Well, I think that not so flattering book review that you got proves one thing. PRI does get published in the Sacramento Bee every now and then.
Perfect.
You're now working with the Hoover Institution on a very interesting project, which is economic progress for Native Americans. So how did you get interested in researching this topic?
Well, let me go back to how I got interested in the topic, and that goes back to 1976. I was visiting a family on the Flathead Reservation here in Montana, taking a Swiss couple who knew that family to visit. And on the way, I tried to explain poverty on reservations, and we arrived, and this family lived in anything but poverty. They had a beautiful home. They had cattle in the field with grass up to their bellies, a nice car, beautiful library. And when I asked the Native American exactly, how do you explain this anomaly? He looked at me across the table and said, I own this place. And after I asked him the same question 3 times, I said, you mean like I own my house? And he said, yes. And it occurred to me that property rights on Indian reservations were quite different than off reservations, and that he had the key to perhaps productivity. So that fast forward then to another PRI project, a book published just after Free Market Environmentalism, a book on Native Americans, and it was called Sovereign Nations or Reservations. And it was my effort at taking the PRI approach, the property rights approach, the market approach to analyzing why reservations are poor, how they got there. And as I got more into it, it just piqued my interest in this research. And now the project I'm doing at Hoover Hoover focuses on three parts. One, old indigenous economies. And what we find there is that Indians understood property rights and markets long before their interaction with Europeans. The second phase is colonial indigenous economies, and that's where they are today, locked in a kind of colonialism from the federal government. And the question is, the third phase, how do we renew indigenous economies? It's an exciting topic, and again, one that PRI was on the ground floor of.
So to give our listeners some context, how many Native American reservations are in America, and what's the Native American population? And if you have this number, what's the population in California?
There are 376, I believe, reservations in the United States. They vary in size from some very tiny ones. California has many quite small ones to huge ones, places like Montana where 2 million acres is quite common for a reservation. So they vary in size. There are a few over 5 million Native people who label themselves as Native Americans. In the census, that's a little less than 2% of the total population. It would be kind of a mid-sized city, if you will. California has 720,000 Native Americans. They have 12% of the Native American population, so a pretty healthy number of people, of Native Americans, live in California. One thing that's clear in all of these cases is that they are poor. Everybody thinks, well, except they have casinos, and maybe we can talk more about that as the conversation goes on, but casinos only work if you are close to I-5 or 101, close to San Francisco, LA. But if you are a tribe in Montana where the largest population is a town Billings of 100,000 and it's 80 miles away, you're not going to get rich off of a casino.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Now, I must admit, my experience on Indian reservations has been limited to Chumash and the other wonderful gaming tribes around the state. I know Ro, though, has visited the Taos Pueblo Reservation in New Mexico, which is quite poor. And as you say, many Native Americans, despite lots of government assistance, live in poverty. So maybe you could expand upon your thoughts on what kind of economic life there is on reservations right now. And aside from casinos, where it's kind of our general assumption that a significant portion of the economy is driven, what is it like on the larger reservation? Is there work? What's the nature of their economy?
Most people have no clue what the average American Indian reservation is like. As you described, most people live in urban areas, and if there's any Indian contact, it's in that casino. And if you look at some of them in the east, where the Pequot in Connecticut that started the revolution, they are just phenomenally rich, but a relatively small tribe, very prosperous casino in an urban area. You go to the Crow Reservation here in Montana, the casino is the most rundown building there is. Nobody goes there to gamble, and few people do, but it's just not, it's not going to be the goose that lays golden eggs for the Crow tribe. I visited the Crow tribe this summer for their 100th Crow powwow, a wonderful event and a great celebration of Indian heritage. But if you stepped outside the powwow, where they had the largest teepee city ever amassed, into Crow Agency, the place where the government buildings are, you would think you'd just been deposited in Venezuela or Nicaragua. It is truly a third world experience. American Indians rank below every single minority group. You name it and they rank below. They've caught up some if you take Indians as a group. Reservation Indians are way under 10,000 in per capita income. At the 2010 census, Blacks, Hispanics, our per capita income is closer to 15 and 20,000. Asians, of course, even higher yet. So we're talking about an incredibly poor group of people. If you look at the 2010 census again, the poverty rate amongst American Indians on reservations is over 30%. If you look at it for all other races, it's 10%. Any measure you use suggests that Indians are poor, and we're kidding ourselves if we think casinos are going to be the answer to getting them out of poverty. And we're really kidding ourselves if we think another government grant will do the trick.
So let's step back in the past for a moment. Before Europeans arrived in North America, what kind of economic institutions did Native Americans have? Could you tell us about the people and how they interacted with each other and even with the other tribes?
Let me start with Dances with Wolves. That's how most people get their image of history of Native Americans. So Kevin Costner's, that movie depicts the Indians as these people who lived communally. They shared everything. They'd go out on a buffalo hunt and get the meat, and they just have this big, wonderful sharing of the buffalo. It was nothing like that. Anthropologists have documented over and over the extent to which American Indians fully understood the importance of a rule of law, the importance of institutions, the importance of markets, and they live by this. Let me just give you a couple of examples of understanding property rights. The investment it took to trap salmon in the Columbia River system in the Pacific Northwest was substantial. You had to build a weir that would channel the salmon in. You had to build a fish wheel that would dip them out of the river. These were huge capital investments at the time. And guess what? To ensure that people got a return on their investments, they were privately owned. They might have been privately owned by a family or a clan, but it wasn't that we all got to share in the proceeds of that fish wheel. Pacific Northwest again, they actually cleared beaches to make what they called clam gardens to improve the clamming potential on these beaches. Imagine moving boulders when you don't have a bobcat loader. This was, again, a huge investment. When American Indians killed buffalo on horseback, they marked their bows, their arrows, and their spears so they knew who rode the horse into that herd. And they rewarded those people who took the risk, who made the investment in being proficient at killing buffalo, and they rewarded them with the best cuts of meat. Over and over, we get these examples from the history that American Indians understood the importance of incentives. They had rules that governed how you behaved. If you broke those rules, if you used somebody else's fish wheel or you tried to steal buffalo meat, you were punished severely for those things. So I think the image we have of this kind of happy, communal, Marxist sort of society is anything but accurate. And part of this project at Hoover is to identify the ways in which American Indians understood the institutions that make people wealthy today.
You have a great story from Lewis and Clark's expedition and their report to Thomas Jefferson. And they found that Native Americans were very entrepreneurial and very interested in trade. So if you wouldn't mind, could you share with our listeners the story of the axe and how it got ahead of them? It's a really great story.
Oh, thank you for asking. It truly is my favorite story and just illustrates so well that trade was an incredibly important part of Native American society. You can look at artifacts from tribes in what we now would call the Midwest today, and they use shells from the oceans. Well, where did they get them? They traded for them. You look at pipestone used in the pipes that Indians used for their ceremonies. There's really only one place in Minnesota where pipestone comes from, and yet it permeated all the tribes, and they all got it from the same place by trading with the Indians who lived in that region. The Lewis and Clark story tells it well. When Lewis and Clark spent their first winter in the Mandan villages of what's now North Dakota, and was a major trading node. That's where tribes from east, west, north, south came together. That winter, the blacksmith for the Lewis and Clark expedition made trade axes. These were metal axes, very valuable because metal was better than stone. Marked them with Lewis and Clark symbol, the Corps of Discovery symbol, and they traded them. They traded them for horses, for blankets, for food. Now, ratchet forward. The expedition takes off, paddles up the Missouri. It's hard to even imagine doing that, but they make it up the Missouri. They get to the three forks of the Missouri, try to decide which fork to take to get over the mountains. Their guide, Sacagawea, tells them to go up the Jefferson River. They follow up the Jefferson. They cross over the mountains. They get to the Nez Perce villages in eastern Washington, and lo and behold, they find one of the trade axes has gotten there before them. Not delivered by FedEx, not delivered by some airplane, but rather was traded over and over again as the Indians traded amongst themselves because one Indian said, well, I'd rather have your horse than my trade axe. And the other Indian said, gains from trade, I'll take it. I think it just illustrates so beautifully the extent to which Native Americans truly understood markets, and they didn't read Adam Smith to figure it out.
We know that Native Americans have a strong cultural tradition of trade and entrepreneurship. And these days there are many programs, namely the Bureau of Indian Affairs, that are specifically geared to helping Native Americans. And yet, as we talked about, many continue to live in poverty. Why do you think this is the case, and what has been some of the U.S.'s policy mistakes in these areas?
The recent government shutdown maybe really illustrates the extent to which these government programs have failed. I read an article after the recent shutdown that described how reservations were simply also shut down. And as you read this article, it says, well, there was no place to get your housing allowance. There was no place to go for health care because the Indian Health Service had shut down. There was no place to go and get your monthly check for welfare because that office was closed down. Nobody was plowing the roads because the Bureau of Indian Affairs controls the money that goes out to take care of the infrastructure. It just illustrates so well how Indian reservation economies are tied to the federal government. These transfers are not the way that they'll get themselves out of what I call colonialism. And I think colonialism is a good way to describe reservation economies. The worst part of it is that reservation land and reservation resources, and I'm talking about the Crow tribe, for example, the largest single owner of coal deposits in the United States, or take the tribes in the Fort Berthold Reservation in the middle of North Dakota and the Bakken Reserve. Their oil and gas and coal are all held in trust by the federal government. Now think what trusteeship means. It means that you are a ward of the state, and the state is the trustee because you, and I use this word from the legislation, you are not deemed competent to own your own resources. Tribes hate this. The chief of the Crow tribe said when Obama announced his war on coal, he said, your war on coal is a war on my people. We want to develop our coal. We want to develop it right, but we want to develop it. The Southern Ute tribe in Colorado has managed to extract itself from this colonialism with some special legislation that has allowed them to determine when, where, and how to develop the oil and gas reserves they have, which are huge. And they are now a very, very wealthy tribe as a result. And so it illustrates the colonialism holds them in bondage, and getting out from under that colonialism is what it takes to make them rich. I love this quote from one of the entrepreneurs of the Winnebago tribe in Nebraska, Lance Morgan, an entrepreneur, 30, 40 years old. And they built this that's called the Ho Chunk Inc. It's a corporation that manages tribal assets, some of which started from casinos. He says, we've taken control of our destiny, gotten a taste of independence, and don't plan on giving it up. Government-led economies have been a total failure. I refuse to believe that the Winnebagos are Karl Marx's last hope. I think it captures both why they're there and how they can get out of it.
So this month you wrote an essay for Hoover titled Native American Heritage. It's Not What You Think. And as we touched on a little bit earlier, many of us tend to romanticize Native American culture and perhaps perpetuate some of its myths, perhaps mostly from Kevin Costner and depictions from Hollywood. Could you break down some of these myths for us?
Yeah, I think it's so important to understand what these myths are, and I would encourage listeners to go to the Hoover website, hoover.org, Finding Ideas, or use my name, Terry Anderson, and they'll find that essay. It's the first of 3 essays, and it covers just the question you asked. And the myths I would categorize as follows. First, there's this cultural myth, the one we've already talked about, the Dances with Wolves myth, that they lived in communes. There's the trade myth, that somehow they wouldn't know how to live in a capitalist society because they didn't trade. They all somehow produced these things and goods, services, housing, and so on, and they didn't really engage in trading with one another other than in kind of ceremonial ways. Total myth. Another, to the word I used a few minutes ago, they are incompetent. They just they're not only not educated, but they just don't have the heritage to take control of their own lives. So we have to keep them wards of the state. And that's what the law says. And it's not me being racist. I'm describing how we have, again, locked them into this ward kind of relationship. And then another myth is they got all this poor land, and how could you expect them to get rich? And yet you go to a reservation, any Western reservation where there's agriculture around it, you step across the line from the outside to the inside, and you go from productive agriculture to not productive unless it's privately owned land. The opening remarks I gave about the person who said, I own this place. There are some private lands on reservations. You don't even need a map to figure out which ones they are. They got good land. I said the Crow tribe is the largest coal owner in the United States. The Southern Ute have huge amounts of oil and gas. And then couple that with tribes that have land along the Grand Canyon and the recreation potential. I've forgotten the name of the tribe, but one of the tribes recently announced that they're going to take over their own campgrounds and they're going to charge higher fees. They've got resources, in this case, recreational resources. And then maybe the worst myth of all, perpetuated by calling them sovereign nation. Chief Justice John Marshall in the 1830s said the relationship of Indians to the federal government is that of a ward to the state. And he said that they are sovereign nations within a nation, but they don't have sovereignty. We don't give them the power to tax. We don't give them the power to own their own property. They are anything but sovereign nations. And I think clarifying that myth that they are is a way to create that kind of sovereignty, which is a necessary and crucial part to them getting out of this colonial bondage.
Can't let you go without discussing the trends in environmental policy making here in our home state, California. Global warming policies such as unrealistic renewable energy goals, strict low carbon fuel standards, subsidies for buying electric cars and solar panels. All of this is dramatically increasing the energy burdens of Californians. Any thoughts on these issues and where the state is going?
Let me go back to the quote from former chairman of the Crow tribe, who said, Obama's war on coal is a war on my people. The war on coal, the whole effort to say we need to do the things California is doing to avoid climate change, to stop global warming, is indeed a war on Indian people for sure, because the resources I just described that they have are the resources that will suffer in this battle to stop climate change. California has decided to do it in a big way, and coming there 3 months a year, I don't suffer too much as a result, but I watch from the sidelines and think this is shooting the state in its foot. These kinds of policies ultimately will come back to haunt California. There's no way that California, the United States, or the world can wean itself from the fossil fuels that have fueled wealth creation in the wealthy nations and will fuel wealth creation in the developing nations. There's no way to replace that fossil fuel with these alternatives, solar and wind and so on. If you're a rich society, and California definitely is, you can afford to pay a lot more for your Teslas and have these alternative fuels. But as you pay more, it dwindles your wealth capacity. And ultimately, I think it will be a huge mistake for California to think they can go it alone. And to think we live in a world where the developing countries are going to say, oh, you're right, we'll just all drive Teslas. It's not they're going to drive Teslas. They want to just get out of walking or riding bicycles. And Teslas is not the step they're going to make. So they're not going to live by the kinds of rules that California has set. And I think California is going to pay the price for trying to be a leader.
Finally, for our last question, it's always a tradition on Next Round to ask our guests for a wine or beer or cocktail recommendation. And we like to do this with PRI's headquarters in San Francisco, so close to wine country. So having published your great article in Hoover, any recommendations for our listeners?
Well, I will give you one for each of the categories, and they all come from a good friend of mine and a good friend of PRI's, Fritz Maytag. Fritz Maytag started the beer microbrewing revolution with Anchor Steam. When he took it over, nobody was thinking of making these niche beers. Anchor Steam, might add that he sold all the businesses I'm going to attribute to him, but Anchor Steam was the leader in breweries. So drink Anchor Steam beer, even if Fritz doesn't still own it. And I was with Fritz recently. He told me that there are 3 breweries a day that open in the United States. And I think most of them are in Bozeman, Montana, where I live. So drink Anchor Steam beer. When it comes to cocktails, again, I'll give Fritz credit. He created a gin called Junipero, and it is the best gin there is. Again, he sold the distillery, but if you want to have a good gin drink, that's the one you want. And finally, he has a wonderful vineyard up in York Creek. He doesn't produce wine now, but if you can find a bottle of Ridge York Creek wine, guaranteed it'll be a bottle you won't be disappointed. in.
Thanks so much, Terry.
Great pleasure. Always great to do these kinds of conversations, especially for an organization as great as PRI.
Thanks to my colleague Tim Anaya and to Terry Anderson. If you're interested in learning more about Terry Anderson's work, visit the Hoover Institution website at hoover.org. Next month, come and celebrate PRI's big 40th anniversary gala dinner in San Francisco on March 23rd. The keynote speaker is Tucker Carlson. To purchase tickets, go to our website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for our next round with PRI.